Another way that governments govern, another form of the way they govern, is authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments are different from totalitarian in that there are some restrictions on authoritarian governments' powers. Authoritarian governments are kept in check by other political and social institutions that the government is unable to control, but has to come to terms with, such as the army, an organized church, organized business groups, or labor. In an authoritarian government, power is organized by the elites through the military, the bureaucracy, religious leaders, or similar authorities. Authoritarian leaders come in several varieties, as leaders of military coups, as appointees of military juntas, perhaps as nationalistic strongmen, or successful bureaucrats. Such regimes impose the group's interest over everyone else. Authoritarian regimes value discipline, duty, obedience, tradition, and respect for authority. In authoritarian regimes, social order supersedes individual rights. The individual is just not that important. Authoritarian leaders have ruled in areas such as Syria, Pakistan, Mexico, and Germany. Another way that governments govern are constitutional governments. Constitutional governments are limited as to what they are permitted to control, as well as how they go about it. That is, they have substantive limits and procedural limits. In fact, only 20 or so of the world's 200-odd governments can be called constitutional governments. And these types of governments were unheard of before the 18th and 19th century. The masses just weren't consulted or integrated into the political process until the rise of constitutional governments. Of course, our government is a constitutional government. Then there are the isms. The isms run on a continuum from liberal to conservative. On one end are the communists and communism. Karl Marx argued that capitalism is unjust and flawed, thereby results in economic hardships for the masses. As a result, capitalism would be replaced with a collective ownership of the means of production, and the ownership would be operated by the state on behalf of the masses. There would be no private ownership of corporations or any way that we make things. According to Marx, only under communism would there be equality of wealth that would ensure true freedom. Marx believed that a political and economic evolutionary process was taking place that would eventually result in the adoption of communism on a worldwide scale. The process, he claims, begins with primitive communalism, that is to say, tribes and clans gathering together, pooling their resources for the greater good of all. The next stage is slavery. The stage following is feudalism. The next stage is capitalism, or the current stage that we're in. And Marx believed that communism was the next stage in this evolution. Marx believed that capitalism must be destroyed and replaced with a classless society through revolutions, or possibly through elections. His follower Lenin argued for revolution and a strong state to counter capitalistic counter-revolution. The Soviet Union became the model of this revolution in 1917, and the revolution was to be exported throughout the world. Following the death of Lenin, Stalin seized power and consolidated the power of the Soviet Union into the state. Stalin believed the strong state was necessary for as long as the Soviet Union was encircled by capitalism. And Stalin established a totalitarian state in the name of communism. The next on the scale you see here is social democracy, or socialism. Social democracy combines elements of democracy, including elections, with collective ownership of the means of production. Advocates of social democracy believe the same goals as communism, but can be achieved through peaceful means and democratic procedures. A variation of Marxist theory, or socialism, that has had some success has been in examples of Germany, Canada, and Britain under the Labour Party. As we move closer to more conservative side, we see liberalism, or capitalism. Liberalism advocates the idea of liberty and freedom and equality before the law, as well as the right to own property. John Locke, Adam Smith, pictured here, and John Stuart Mill are the leading liberal philosophers. As we move to the right, literally and politically, we enter the realm of conservatism. Conservatists defend the status quo from attacks by classical liberals. Conservatists resist the social change advocated by Locke, and Edmund Burke, pictured here, was a leading conservative because he witnessed the horrors of liberalism in the French Revolution. And then moving to the extreme right of our continuum, we see fascism. Fascists oppose the spread of communism and liberal democracy. They advocate the unity of the state into a single, organic whole, and the leader and the state are the embodiment of the national will, and protection of private ownership of property is paramount. And we've seen examples of this in fascist Europe, leading up and into World War II. How has democracy, or government rather, how has government evolved over time, moving from a state of nature to a state that the United States is in a state of democracy? Well, to understand this, we first have to understand what is the state of nature. The state of nature is sort of a, perhaps it's fictional, we're not sure, but it's the belief that once upon a time, man lived in a perfect state of nature, an existence without any laws or any government. This is perfect freedom. Philosophers have attempted to understand the quality of life in the state of nature as a means to explain why government was created. Whether the state of nature actually existed at any point in time is not the point. The point is that we have a starting point here to understand where rights come from. Thomas Hobbes was thinking about the state of nature when he said, quote, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them in awe, they are in a condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man." And so Thomas Hobbes obviously was not a big fan of this state of nature, because we are going to be continuously in a state of high alert to protect our own interests, our own stuff, against any roving vagabond person who wants to take the stuff away from you. John Locke, also political philosopher, was thinking about the state of nature when he said, To understand political power right and to derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any man. Now this may sound good, but the uncertainty associated with the state of nature is really depriving man of his ability to develop socially and economically. We're going to stay in a kind of Stone Age social structure where it's every man for himself. So if you have complete freedom, you also have complete responsibility. Nobody's going to protect you. A literary point of reference would be William Golding's The Lord of the Flies, which you may have read. In The Lord of the Flies, a plane crash deposits schoolboys on a desert island, or what we're going to call the state of nature. There are no rules, there are no government. The boys unite and create a civil society, without which fear and anarchy would exist. However, conflict erupts over the type of government that should exist for the security of the society, and if you read the book, well, you'll understand that a lot of bad things happen. And what's also shocking about The Lord of the Flies, I think, if you've read it, you'll agree how quickly we tend to devolve into a state of the state of nature, this man against man, or every man for himself kind of thought. So we move from the state of nature, because we're talking about how government evolves over time. So we're in a state of nature, and now we're going to start moving into a state called civil society. Because the fear and uncertainty that dominated the existence in the state of nature required the formation of civil society. It's an agreement to give up perfect freedom for greater security. The development of civil society was intended to free man from uncertainty and fear associated with nature. Thomas Hobbes says about this, a commonwealth, or what he calls a civil society, is said to be instituted when a multitude of men do agree in covenant, every one with every one, that to whosoever man or assembly of men shall be given by the majority part the right to represent the person of them all, that is to say, to be their representative. Every one, as well he that voted it as he that voted against it, shall authorize all actions and judgments of that man or assembly of men in the same manner, as if they were his own, to the end to live peaceably among themselves, and to be protected against other men. And so that is a civil society, where people give up some of their rights to be able to have greater security. Again, let's look at John Locke. John Locke says, men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of his estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living. When men have so consented to make one community or government, they make one body politic, where the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest.